Hello and welcome. I'm Ijoma Onyato. Tonight, 1 week after signing the budget into law, federal government set to release 350 billion naira for capital projects across the country. Female suicide bombers strike at Delari IDP camp in Maiduguri, Borno State, killing 16 people. Controversy trails diversion of relief materials meant for internally displaced persons of Bakassi. Senator Katagiwa and Cross River State government trade blame. And at least one person killed and several injured after van plows into worshippers at Finsbury Park Mosque in North London.
And on business news tonight, Africa Finance Corporation plans local currency funding to meet Nigeria's infrastructure deficit.
And in sports news, world champions Germany defeat Australia to begin their FIFA Confederations Cup on a solid note.
Former Benue State Governor Gabriel Sosuam and two others arraigned over alleged diversion of Shopee Fund.
The federal government is to release a total of 350 billion naira for capital projects across the country. At the public presentation of the 2017 Appropriation Act in Abuja, the Minister of Finance, Mrs. Kemi Adeosun, says the funds will address the infrastructure needs in the country. She also says other capital releases will follow afterwards to allow for the needed development.
Just a few weeks ago, the 2017 budget of 7.4 trillion naira was given assent by Acting President Yemi Osinbajo, making it an act of parliament. This was greeted with a sigh of relief by many Nigerians who believe it will ease the present economic hardship they are facing. And since then, government officials have been meeting to make the budget realize its objective.
The security of the nation has to be the #1 priority of government. And so we have to make sure that interior as well as defense. So as you can see, 472 billion for interior, 330 billion for defense.
This underscores the federal government of Nigeria's commitment to opening up the budget process and making it more participatory. This Nigerian government is committed to accountable governance. Hence, the President signed the Open Government Partnership in July 2016, making Nigeria the 70th member country.
The Minister of Finance asks Nigerians not to panic as she announced that releases from the 2017 appropriation will soon be made available. The 2017 budget represents a 22% increase over the 2016 budget. Sectors like defense, works and power, transport, agriculture and education top the list.
We're to focus on critical, ongoing infrastructure projects such as roads, railway, and power, to utilize the special economic zones and industrial parks to support the development of manufacturing, which had been very, very challenged over the years, and then contributing to food security and creating a platform for agro-business.
There's approximately 6 months remaining in the year 2017, and many Nigerians hope that government walks its talk on how to improve the economy through this budget.
Well, to take another look at Budget 2017 and its implementation, I'm now being joined on the news at 10 by the Director of Budget, Mr. Ben Akabweze. He joins me from Abuja. Thanks for joining us on the news at 10.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Right, we saw you there at the presentation as well, but let's just start from the theme for Budget 17, being called the Budget of Economic Recovery and Growth, and also the release of the planned release of the 350 billion. Is that meant to jumpstart the recovery?
Well, the recovery is already well underway, as you know. In the first quarter of this year, even though we're still in negative territory, but we've come all the way up from negative 1.55% GDP performance in the last quarter of 2016 to 0.52% negative in quarter one. So recovery is well underway already. But yes, the 350 billion naira capital release will further accelerate our exit from recession and getting on the growth path.
Okay, what's the action plan for that 350 before we get into the main budget itself? Because looking through the document, we didn't quite see how it's going to be spread and what capital projects you're going to start off with. So could you shed more light on that?
Well, as the Honourable Minister for Budget and National Planning indicated today in his presentation, capital releases henceforth will be project specific. And so, we will basically make targeted releases to projects that are, ready for implementation and that align with the beginning with the five key, implementation priorities under the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan. I mean, that's not to say other sectors will not get capital releases, but those, key implementation priorities will be prioritized even in this initial release of capital.
All right, now let's just look at the allocation that you have to some of the critical sectors. Power, 553.71 billion, and you see education, 151.9 billion. Would you say that's sufficient, in terms of allocation?
No, I wouldn't say that's sufficient. I mean, I'll be first to admit that the entire budget of 7.44 trillion naira is not really sufficient for our needs as a country, and so really none of the allocations to each of the sectors can be considered sufficient relative to the needs that we have. But it does represent a stretch and how far we can go at this point in time.
Well, since obviously you work, you're from the budget office as well, and we were listening to UNICEF last week talking about how at least 26% of budgets should be allocated to education if we're serious about economic recovery in that area, and we see even far less than that in this budget. So how exactly did you come about the sort of allocations that you're making if you're saying that it's not sufficient even from the beginning?
Well, first of all, let me clarify. When UNICEF talks about 26%, we're talking about 26% of the budget for nations. We're talking here about the federal government of Nigeria's budget. There are Nigeria is organized along three tiers of government. The states as well as the local governments. To be able to determine how much is allocated to education in Nigeria, you'll have to aggregate the allocations to education of the federal government, the state governments, and all the local governments. Each of these other tiers of governments have budgets as well. And that's how you can then measure, whether we are meeting the 26% or not. Having said that, you'll also have to look at, trends. I mean, not just the absolute numbers. We are making an effort to improve allocation to some of those critical, human development, sectors. But we have such a huge backlog of, in terms of infrastructure. And infrastructure, private individuals, yes, you have some interventions by the private sector in road construction, for instance, but that's essentially an area that is left to the state. On the other hand, with sectors like education, you'll also have to reckon with the amount of private investment that is going into those sectors to fill some of the gap that we have there.
In terms of funding the budget, are you concerned at all about the funding, seeing that you have a different figure from what the executive proposed to what was eventually signed? Are you comfortable about funding the budget in the time we have?
First of all, I mean, the difference between the size of the budget proposed by the executive and that passed by the National Assembly was essentially the result of the additional revenues that the National Assembly created by varying oil price benchmark from $42.50 per barrel to $44.5 dollars per barrel. So that incremental expenditure was funded by the variation in the reference, the budget oil price reference price. So that's not a problem. We think that the $45.5 dollars per barrel is also reasonable. Nevertheless, yes, there is a concern about funding the budget. First of all, our revenue target for 2017 is 5 trillion naira, a little over 5 trillion naira, and that's a significant increase from the 3.9 trillion that we budgeted in 2016 and which we were hard pressed to meet. So it's going there's some stretch there, and that's why you hear us in government talking a lot these days about getting the revenue generating agencies to to rev up their performance. But then also the 2017 budget is the deficit budget. It has about 2.3 trillion naira of deficit, almost all of which is going to be funded by debt, some of which is domestic, some of which is going to be foreign. And so that itself, raising the debt also represents some challenge and will require some effort.
All right, thank you so very much, Director of Budget, Mr. Ben Habweze, for sharing your thoughts with us on the News at 10 tonight. We move on now, and the National Emergency Management Agency has confirmed the death of 16 people after multiple suicide attacks in the Dalari area of Maiduguri, the Borno state capital. Eyewitnesses say the explosion occurred when 2 female terrorists detonated explosives strapped to their bodies. 35 minutes later, 2 other suicide bombers, also female, were intercepted while trying to gain access to the Dalari 2 IDP camp. Dalari has been a major target area for the Boko Haram terrorists. Both attacks occurred when the Muslims in the area began to retire after observing their Ramadan night prayers. The Boko Haram insurgency has caused about 100,000 deaths since 2009, and the attacks have continued despite the insurgents losing most of the territories they once controlled. And staying in the northeast, the Nigerian Army has provided more instructional and educational materials to children at the school in the Maholi camp in Adamawa State. The Army says the children have many needs, but they are committed to ensuring that more than 500 students enrolled in the school are exposed to good teaching.
Brigade Commander of the 23 Armored Brigade, Brigadier General Bello Mohammed, in the company of Adamawa State government officials, arrived at the Malkoi IDP camp and are received by the children. Their mission is in continuation of the military support on education on the camp. So far, there are 10 military instructors of the 18 teachers here. To strengthen this bond, the Army now donates education items and wares.
I consider it a unique opportunity to be part of a life-touching event for one of our most less privileged and victims of insurgencies, members of our dear society, the internally displaced persons. The foresight of our Chief of Army Staff in the support of the internally displaced persons, especially in the area of education, is comparable to none in the present-day Nigeria.
And the state government is glad for this gesture, especially because it presents opportunities where they would otherwise have not existed.
We were at Kufore camp at one time, and we were told that almost all the children would never have had opportunities to go to school if not for the schools that were open in IDP camps. And we realized that some of them did not even know anything about education until they came to these camps. We are praying that by this gesture of educating our IDP children, we will be able to say tomorrow that some of them have risen to positions of prominence to the point that they will remember their stay in this place, not with anger, but with gratitude to God that He has used this location to open up avenues for them to become very useful citizens and to become the future leaders of this country.
There are 1,500 IDPs on Malkoi camp, out of which about 500 of both young and old are enrolled into the primary and nursery schools.
In part two, after the break, Cross River State Government and Senator Florence Itagawa trade blame over diversion of relief materials meant for Bakassi internally displaced persons. That's in a moment. Please stay with us.